Hi there, and welcome to Fantasy for the Ages, the show where father and son sit down and talk about books and fantasy. I'm the son of that equation, Zach.
And I'm the father, Jim. Great to have you with us today as we kick off a new series for us.
Woohoo!
Not that we're reading a brand new book series, a new series of midweek episodes. Yeah,
Darn,
this
I had
is
my hopes up.
no, you cannot escape the wheel of time yet. Not even close.
Oh, that makes me look bad, like I don't like it now.
Oh, no, perish the thought. We love that series. But there's so much goodness to talk about in fantasy and sci-fi, so we have to go into other directions. And this is a new series called To Read or Not to Read, where we will be talking about other fantasy and sci-fi series that we're familiar with and giving our thoughts on it. And in the end, boiling it down to whether or not you should read it or not read it. That's
Sounds
our
about right.
thoughts. Zach, how you doing today?
I'm doing okay. It's still another cold snap. I'm really looking forward to when the months change in the other direction. We got to get through these winter months. Let's get back into summer. I don't do well with cold, and I moved to
What's a
Texas so that I
cold
don't have
snap?
to deal with it.
In Texas, what is a cold snap?
I mean, we're at like 30.
Brr.
We've gotten
Actually, that
cold.
is colder than
Yeah,
us.
we actually got cold.
Oh, we're at 45 today. So Jordan in the Discord says it's minus 30. I'm assuming, I don't know, is that Fahrenheit or is that Celsius? No, minus 30
Honestly, at that
Celsius would
point,
be horrible, right?
actually, it's not that big of a difference because I think it's minus 40 that they're actually the same.
That's what he just said in Discord, too. Minus 40 is minus 40. Well, minus 30 is freaking cold then, and I'm going to stay out of Canada. All right. In the pandemic, they won't let me in there anyways.
Hmm.
Well,
Anyway, how you doing, Dad?
I'm doing good. I'm not as cold as you are. I've got nothing super big to complain about. I mean, in the life of Jim, I had my annual physical yesterday, and the doctor said, quit gaining weight. I really didn't need to go to him to know that. It's true. I should stop that.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Fair.
So I'm actually not drinking as much these days. I've mentioned that already, but I sure am drinking today because for these, I've got something. And this is I made an interesting drink.
It
It's
does
not
look
a Watttail.
interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it looks kind of like a Long Island, but murky.
It's a Wiki Waki Woo. I didn't make it up.
Come
I
again?
found a recipe. A Wiki Waki Woo. It's very fruity, actually. So sweet, fruity, but it's got a lot of similar ingredients to a Long Island with vodka and rum, triple sec. But then it's got a healthy dose of amaretto. Oh, it does have tequila too. But then it's got pineapple juice, orange juice, and cranberry juice all mixed in. And it's pretty tasty. Wiki Waki Woo. What are you drinking?
Well, I considered making a nice cocktail, figuring something out, and then decided I probably actually wouldn't like a cocktail version of a Turkish delight. So decided to pull it back, not go with that, and just have some bourbon and Coke.
I'm just trying to picture you drinking something called a Turkish delight, and you take one taste, and you're like, yeah, that doesn't sound tasty to drink. All right. Well, what we're going to talk about today, since we've started this new series, we have to pick one. And we're going to be talking about C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia today. That's what we're going to feature for To Read or Not to Read.
That is a series.
Indeed. I want to give a little ground rules, though, since it's the first time we're doing one of these. And that is, have no fear. This is still spoiler-lite, just like we do Wheel of Time episodes. So we're not going to give the whole plot away. We're not going to ruin these stories. Maybe someone hasn't read these. Maybe someone isn't familiar. I know in the Discord, Jordo with us today, he hasn't read these. A lot of people are familiar with them already, but we are definitely not going to spoil them, just in case you decide, I want to go check those out later.
especially because if after listening to this episode, you decide that you really should or really shouldn't read this series, now you know.
That's right. We also want to point out this will be highly subjective. We're not doing this like some shows do with a literary analysis and really getting deep into the structural creation of the story. And nah, we're just going to talk about what do we think? What are some key points?
There are wonderful creators out there with a lot of interesting ideas and perspectives. We're not that smart.
Yeah, if you want deep stuff, you're somewhere else. We're just here to entertain you, okay? And we're going to entertain ourselves, and we're going to have some fun talking about some books. That's what we do. We will try, however, to give legit reasons at the end of this as to why we think you might or might not want to read this series, why you might or might not enjoy it. We're not just going to make something up. We'll give a rationale.
Yeah. Even if that rationale is entirely arbitrary.
Which it could be. All right. Let's start out just with some facts. Just a few facts about this series.
Fast facts.
This is a 7. I can get my reflection right. There's first book. When I read this series, this was the first book. This is a 7-book series. And look, if I put it up there, you can see at the bottom, it says book 1. Book 1. You can't buy these anymore. Okay, this is no longer book 1 of the series.
No, because it's not chronologically.
This was book 1, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when it was published back in 1950. There are 7 books in this series. I went to find my 7 and only found 5 of them. I don't know where the other 2 are. My set is missing now.
I do have a copy of all of these books. I don't have it in my hands with me. I could go get it. But moreover, I have a copy because they're all in one book for me.
Well, I have to tell you, I was tickled by the fact the 5 I have are the 5 good ones. I couldn't find the other 2. Now,
I think I know where they are.
Very subjective. You know where they are.
I think I do. No. I took them to read to children.
They're at the center. You let the preschool children have these books now?
No.
You were reading them
I
to
read
them
to them. I got through 1.5 of the books, and then someone else was going to finish the other book. You'll have to take it up with your wife if you want to know where they are now.
All right. I'm going to have to hunt those down.
That was like 2 years ago.
Those are the 2. So the books are The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is the publication order, starting in 1950. And then straight through to 1956, 1 book per year was published. Interestingly, this isn't the order he wrote them. The publication order is a little different from actually how he wrote them, but this is how the publishers decided they would come out. So The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, then Prince Caspian, then The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Silver Chair.
We're at 4.
Yeah, A Horse and His Boy, and The Magician's Nephew, finishing with The Last Battle.
So the last battle was still last.
Yeah, I was hesitating as to 5 and 6, which order they originally were, but I think I have it right.
I don't know.
The Last Battle wasn't the last one he wrote, actually. The Magician's Nephew was the last one he wrote. But The Last Battle kind of needed to be the last book. That made sense.
I mean, maybe.
Yeah. Now, if you try to find them, like in the photo at the beginning, I'm going to pop this back up here. You can see this is the chronological order that you get them in now.
In many ways, but not all of them, the correct order.
So it does start with The Magician's Nephew, which takes place decades before the start of the actual series that you see in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So, just some facts about the series there. It is mostly set in 1940s Great Britain during World War II. However, it's also taking place in a magical world called Narnia, which has a very different time flow. So that's a whole nother confusing thing that we will not dig deep into in this series, in this episode. Also, with the basic facts, it has had a major influence on the fantasy genre that we know today. There's a few particular series worth highlighting here. Philip Pullman's fantasy series, His Dark Materials. I haven't read those, but Zach, I think you have,
I've read
right?
some of them. They are interesting and really were a reaction to this series, giving a uh, similar take in a very different narrative.
Yeah, so that comes from the author. He's like, he didn't like the Chronicles of Narnia at all. He really hated those books, but they did inspire what he ended up writing as the antithesis. No, that's the wrong word, not antithesis, but basically taking the same kind of ideas of a story and doing something totally different in tone, in background, in
I like to think of them
underpinnings.
as like cousin series. They're not close enough related to be siblings, but they are still related.
Okay. Recently, I read Lev Grossman's The Magician's Trilogy.
Hmm.
That's another series that has direct ties to the Chronicles of Narnia. And in
Hmm.
fact, Lev Grossman wanted to make it explicit that Narnia was a real thing that had connection to his books.
Instead, he
And
had to go with fillery.
yeah, fillery, because the lawyers got in the way. They legitimately didn't think they could get away with it. They might get
Hmm.
sued.
But
So
let's be real. Anytime you've read or watched anything with the magicians, you know fillery's just Narnia.
absolutely. So again, that's another series that exists because of the Chronicles of Narnia and its influence. The last one that I'll mention, you don't see explicit references, but J.K. Rowling has been clear that she loved the Chronicles of Narnia as a young person, and they inspired her writing of the Harry Potter series. Not that Harry Potter has anything like Narnia in it; it's very different, and yet the magic, the different kinds of things. I mean, there's elements that come from myth and fairy that clearly are in Chronicles of Narnia, and she stuck the same sorts of things in Harry Potter. She
Now,
loved that kind of writing.
I do have one more like authorial note of just importance that this series has to fantasy. Um, and it's just kind of a throwaway that a lot of people know. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, very good friends. So these two, in ways, are some of the quote unquote founding fathers of fantasy.
Of at least modern fantasy.
Yes.
C.S. Lewis had written numerous books before the Chronicles of Narnia, some of them fiction, some of them nonfiction, but they were very heavily leaning into being about Christianity, even fiction that was an allegory or telling stories that tried to teach the theology of Christianity in a new and novel way. An example is the Screw Tape Letters. I've read that. I enjoy that. It's a nice story, but it's clearly teaching Christian doctrine. This story, The Chronicles of Narnia, according to C.S. Lewis, was not intended to do the same thing as what he had
That
done
being
before.
said, if you've read it, I mean, C.S. Lewis was off his rocker if he thought this wasn't doing that.
Well, no,
I'm
what he
sorry.
wanted to say was really I don't know, he'd maybe say it's influenced by the Bible and the Christian story, but he's not trying to intentionally make parallels and allegory here. That's what he
Meanwhile,
says.
I literally had this series as some of my reading in a college course talking about the theological themes within fantasy literature.
Yeah, oh, it's all there. And we'll talk more about that as we go. I have one more thing to talk about with the facts, and that is Lewis did go on to write more works after this, and one of them was what's considered his other great fiction work, the Space Trilogy. It's science fantasy. I tried to read it. I read the first two books. The first one was okay. The second book, I had to force myself to finish. And the third book, even though I own it, I've never read it. I lost interest. So,
Is
a very
it
different tone than the Chronicles of Narnia.
is it bad that I've never heard of it?
It's not quite as popular and definitely not as influential. So, all right, those are some facts. Now let's get into just talking about our thoughts here on this series.
Mm-hmm.
Figured we could start off with our personal experiences. How have you encountered the Chronicles of Narnia? I'll mention it's certainly one of the earliest fantasy series that I read.
Hmm.
Was familiar with long ago. I couldn't tell you the first time I read them. I'm sure it was somewhere in childhood. Probably around the same time I was reading The Wizard of Oz and those
Okay.
books. There's 14 of those in the original series. And then there's 7 of these, around the same age, maybe. I was reading these, 3rd grade, 4th grade, something like that. I've read this series multiple times. I haven't read it in quite a while now. I'd say I read it many times before I knew there was so much more. Well, I read it many times before there was so much more. I'm old, okay?
You're not that old.
There wasn't a lot. Fantasy exploded in the 80s and 90s, and I was around in 70. So, I found these in the 70s. And I read them multiple times. And then as a teacher, back in the 90s, I was reading them to my students, 5th graders. They ate it up. I loved them. How about you? What's your personal experience with the series?
Well, that last part kind of ties perfectly in because this is another one of those key series that I remember you actually started reading to me as a kid. Or rather, when I was a kid, not when you were a kid. That would have been a little weird. But no, I have distinct memories of this being like a road trip book. We would be in the car and you'd be reading to us in the car through some of these. And I think it was on a road trip somewhere we found what I kind of put this series as the big thing for me. And that's the first ever audiobooks that I listened to. It was a nice set of like 14, 22, something like that, CDs.
Yeah.
And a whole dramatized production. It is not a straight read through. If you try to read along with it, it doesn't work. It cuts bits out and it puts little bits of more narration or sound effects in. But it was a really cool idea. And I think one of the best ways I've had to encounter the series. But it just was a foundational, fun, family-friendly fantasy for me at a very early age.
Your mom thinks this might be the first series you would remember me reading to you. I mean, I read the Harry Potter stuff to you younger.
The problem with that is it might be the first that I remember you reading at least all of to me, because the first couple books of Harry Potter that you read, I had to reread myself later to remember. But the later books didn't come out until I was a little older. So I remember those just fine.
Yep. All right. Well, what would we say are the general strengths of this series? Whoa, just silence.
That's an awkward way. I think it is a fun story. There definitely are ebbs and flows that are good bits and bad bits and well-written parts and not so well-written parts. But at the end of the day, it has fun, compelling tales within it, at least. Even if the whole thing, parts of it are lacking. I have a particular umbrage with certain books. But for the most part, each self-contained tale within the novels are just fun.
Okay. A strength I'd say is that it does tie in a lot of elements from myth and from fantasy, just general world fantasy, and brings them into relevant ways in this Narnia. And it does have an explanation within world of why Narnia exists and how that actually ties into our world. The author does create some logic for what's going on here. Now, does the logic hold up? I don't know. But there is a sense written into it. The other strength, I'd say, well, I got 2 more strengths. One is you got 7 books, and they do all make one complete story. Okay, there's different elements and pieces to things, but he's done some things in different books that have payoffs later and tie in ways, and then it all kind of comes together in book 7. I know you don't like book 7.
Yeah,
if I
that's the
remember right.
problem. The last book is by far my least favorite.
And it was, I agree, not agree that it's my least favorite. I give that to definitely A Horse and His Boy.
That one
But
grew on me.
Nah. But he does tie up all the loose ends in the last battle, I felt. It brought the story to a definite conclusion. And a lot of things that were referenced in previous books, well, here we are. Here's the tie-in now for the finish. So I liked that. The other strength, I'd say, is simply that he does create some characters that you can connect with to some degree or other. You've got the Pevensey children. You've got then Eustace, what a name, and Jill that come into play, and they go through adventures where, especially, this was really written for younger people. There are some connections that in the decisions these characters make that young people could parallel to their own choices, their own lives, and then maybe draw something out of that has relevance. So I'd say that's a strength.
I would go so far as to say with those characters, C.S. Lewis creates paragons without going so far as making caricatures.
Okay. Discord is asking something or highlighting something here. The last book, regardless of the version, is called The Last Battle. There's a chapter in the last book of The Wheel of Time called The Last Battle. I'm wondering which one's longer now.
Oh, by far the chapter.
Yeah, this only has 184 pages in the paperback, The Last Battle. Yeah, I'm pretty sure The Last Battle in A Memory of Light is much longer. Maybe Jordan
the copy
can check
you
on
have,
that.
the pages are bigger, and I think it's still more.
So these are not super long read. The whole series is probably just a couple of books from The Wheel of Time. So you can read through them pretty quick. Let's talk about weaknesses. General weaknesses of this series. Zach, I know you've got some things to say.
Yeah, I've got some.
Go for it.
The first weakness I'm going to point out can be a strength depending upon what you're looking for. The theological, especially Christian themes, are quite heavy-handed. That can be a strength if you're looking for it, but if you're not, it can be kind of in your face. Now, if you just don't know at all about that world of things, you might miss some of it, but you won't miss all of it. It's right there. So if that's not what you're looking for in fantasy, that's a weakness.
I don't think you have to be Christian to understand the themes of the story and to get it. No. But if you are Christian and you know those things, there's some tie-ins that are obvious to you, which one might say makes it a richer read. But you would go the other direction?
I would go depending on your audience. It could be either direction.
Okay.
So I acknowledge some people will find it richer for that, and some will be really turned off on the story from it. I mean, clearly, His Dark Materials was written because some people were really turned off by it. Another weakness that I would say, and this really wasn't so much a weakness at the time, but has grown to be one now. For someone who does read and like fantasy, if you haven't picked this up and you do, you'll find it to be very tropey. There are going to be a lot of things that are just big hitters, common things that you're going to see in fantasy. And they're not even done like super creatively or new, simply because they were a little more creative and new at the time, but now it's like the most basic form of them.
But again, this is old enough that it wasn't tropey. This was when it was brand new.
Unfortunately, that doesn't give it a pass to a modern reader.
You just need to be aware. Yep. Something that I think speaks in its favor, even though we're talking about weaknesses now, is that anyone who's played Dungeons and Dragons, pick these books up and read them. you go, oh yeah. I mean, you're familiar with tons of types of characters that are in here. Or any other fantasy that you read. We've got your dwarfs, we've got your elves, we've got, all these fauns and satyrs and centaurs and all these kind of creatures.
Can I have you say that one with the goat hooves again?
Satyrs? Fawns?
Satyrs.
Satyrs?
However, C.S. Lewis does call them fawns.
Whatever. All those things would be very recognizable to today's fantasy readers and, like I said, D&D players and stuff. But back at the time, these weren't nearly so common in what people were reading and talking about.
In many ways, another strength is that it's very approachable.
But there we get to a weakness. It's very simple. Yeah. The writing style is not deep. It's, one could say, somewhat shallow. Because it's written for
kids.
Kids. That's right. This is not intended to be for a deep audience. Maybe
there are deeper
the idea is that
parents
might read it to their children. Grandparents might read it to their grandkids. It's not really written for the adult reader who wants to think heavily about what they're reading.
One last weakness I just want to throw out. Some of the books suck.
Ouch. I can't agree with that. I don't say they suck.
Some of the books are really awesome. Some of the books are okay.
Voyage of the Dawn Treader gets a little long.
Voyage of the Dawn Treader is the best one.
Yeah. Wow. See, we do have some differences.
However, The Last Battle sucks. And most of those payoffs that you like, I'm like, either feel like cop-outs or forced.
I found the book The Silver Chair to be a little long, like, really? Can we get done with this?
The Silver Chair feels like it has a lot of filler and then like a really good start, a really good end, and a lot of filler in between.
Like fillery?
Sure.
See what I did there? Yeah.
I don't know how a 200-page book has a bunch of filler, though.
Well, Puddle Glum. That's how it has a lot of filler, right there.
Now, that being said, the good books, the ones that I think shine in this series, I've read multiple times, whether being read to me, read myself, or read to others. They're worth it. So you do have books that shine. Unfortunately, you have books that just are not really good.
So let's boil this down then. Would you ever read this series again, Zach?
Circumstantially. Which is to say, this is one of the series on my list of I might read to my kids one day.
Okay.
Will I ever read it again just myself? Probably not.
Yeah, I've read it multiple times already. I've got too much else to read now. I'm not reading it again. And if you want your kids to experience it, yeah, you're going to have to read it yourself, because I don't figure they're going to be at my house long enough to read through this whole series. You've got to take care of it.
You said it was a quick read.
Not that quick. So some of these last questions, these are things we're going to ask about every series we feature here.
Okay.
So rating scale, 1 to 100, with 100 being the best. This is very subjective now, but how do you feel you'd rate this series on that scale compared to everything else you've read in fantasy fiction?
See, I put some thought into this, and I decided I think the Chronicles of Narnia is the perfect baseline at 50 for me. There's a lot that's better, there's a lot that's worse, but it's just kind of like that perfect, even-keeled, this is fantasy. This isn't great fantasy, this isn't terrible fantasy, but this is what I judge fantasy around.
Okay. I'd go 40. Okay, and my reason for being below you...
You've read more good stuff.
Oh, maybe. It's just fantasy has grown so much since this day. It doesn't hold up to what fantasy has become. So it was influential, and at its time, it would get far higher rating, but it doesn't benefit from the fact that it was the only game in town practically at its time. We're talking about based on everything I've read, and I think 40 might be generous.
What's crazy?
I'm probably giving an giving it a nostalgic note, because that means I have to have, 39% of what I've read is worse than Chronicles of Narnia.
I
Wow.
don't think of it as percentages. I'm thinking of it on like, of what I've read, 100 being this is the best book of all time, to 1 being why did I read this? This was a waste of my time. But like, that doesn't mean I have a book in every slot.
Well, no, but the way I interpret it is, where does it fall on the spectrum? And okay, 40. I might go ahead and 30 would have been okay too. Somewhere down in that segment.
I do think it's wild that throughout most of this, I've been pointing out a lot of the negatives, and you've been pointing out a lot of the positives, but my score's higher than yours.
Yeah, you're messed up. That's okay. I love you anyways. Discord is commenting, if for a 10-year-old, how would you rate it? It's like, well, it would have to be higher for a 10-year-old, because there's stuff that I have strong on my list that I would hope no 10-year-old is ever reading yet. So, narrower perspective. Yeah, I hope they're not reading the first Law trilogy as a 10-year-old. That mess you up. And stay away from A Song of Ice and Fire as a 10-year-old.
I don't know if their reading level's that high.
Yeah, but it'll mess them up. Okay. What sort of person do we think might enjoy this series?
A child.
Oh, a child. So if you are above the age of 12, don't read it, is what Zach is saying.
No, I would say children, lovers of classic fantasy.
Okay.
Those looking to expand towards more older or children focused books, like parents. And I'd even also throw in those really turned off by the turn in fantasy towards grimdark.
Good point.
If you if you've run into a grimdark book or two and gone, this is really not for me, you probably actually would enjoy the Chronicles of Narnia.
It's not that everything is rosy and wonderful. I mean, these stories are like any good story that you've got a plot. There's a problem that happens, and the characters have to overcome a challenge, an issue. There are bad things that happen to the characters in the story. There's evil in the world, but it's not grimdark.
Tone is fantastical. It's not a gritty, realistic fantasy fiction. It is a light fantasy
that features Deus ex Liona.
Correct.
Very, very clearly. Yes.
PETA would probably not like the book.
What?
PETA would not like these books.
PETA? You drawing from Mockingjay?
Nope, I'm drawing from real life.
PETA,
as in the organization about animals
protection
and cruelty.
Okay.
People for the ethical treatment of animals.
Why? What am I missing? Why?
Spoilers.
Okay.
Something to do with the table.
Okay. That one event.
I mean, it's a pretty big event. It's not the only thing.
Okay. I think your analysis of who would enjoy the series is pretty apt. Discord adds in people who like fantasy tropes might enjoy this series. And I'd say
also
anybody
puts it in my favorite version of the PETA acronym, which is people eating tasty animals.
Yes. Which is everyone who's not a vegetarian. And I'd say people who would enjoy this series are ones who really want to fill in the gaps of how did we get to here in fantasy fiction. You need to read this book to understand the influences that came, that it had on what came after. If you are missing Chronicles of Narnia, you're missing a piece of the history of how we got to fantasy fiction now. And again, it's not very long, so you can plow through them. It might be safe to say you could just read the first historically the first book. Again, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And you could stop there if you're just trying to fill in some gaps like that.
Probably.
All right. Final question.
Okay.
In the most general of terms, should the average person read this series, and why or why not?
Can I answer this in two different ways, kind of?
It's our show. You can do whatever you want.
Sweet. Should the average person read this series? Yes. Should the average fantasy reader of modern fantasy read this series? I'm not sure I'd say yes. Should people who like it and into any of our categories? Absolutely. But just what I consider to be the average modern fantasy reader doesn't necessarily fall in that category. It requires a little more thought of going, do I want to read this? Now, should they read one book from it? Yes. But should they read the entire series?
So
That's
the last battle. They should
that
read
is
the last
the
battle.
incorrect one. If I was just judging a book, that one would be very close to my one. Not that low, but pretty close.
All right. My take on this, should the average person read this series? No. Don't waste your time anymore. If you're just an average Joe out there, there's so much better to read. And you only have so much time in your life. I wouldn't say, oh, you've got to read this. Go get this one in. No. Yeah, you'll get by. You'll be fine. But there are plenty of people who will enjoy this series. And I don't regret that it's part of my background and that I've read it multiple times. Don't regret it at all.
Can I amend how I said the average person should read this book?
No.
Too bad. Gonna do it anyway. Yes, the average person should read it, but they should read it when they're a child. So if you've missed it, you've missed it. Don't go back. You're doomed. You live a sad life. I'm sorry.
Don't do it.
But for anyone who's listening in the future, if you're still like 5, 6, 7, go read this book. It's a really good starter fantasy. So I think everyone should read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when they're a kid. And if they go, I hate this, they probably aren't going to be that huge of a fan of fantasy.
Possibly.
But if they like it, they might.
Discord is making comments here regarding possibly the difficulty of this last question of defining what an average person is. Everybody may think of themselves as average.
Nah, I'm weird.
I'm above average in some things and below average in others.
I think that's the definition of average.
Exactly. So maybe I have to rephrase this question eventually. Discord. It all averages out. Nice, Jordo. All right. That's all we have to say about the Chronicles of Narnia. If you haven't read it, we've given you something to think about. We haven't told you what the story is about at all because, again, that's not what this series is about. We're just giving you our thoughts on should you read it or should you not? And now we've given you something to ponder. If you enjoyed this series, this particular episode, be sure to like it here below, right where it shows like
down there
in the video. Yeah. And we'd love to see you subscribe to our channel. If you're listening to this on the audio feed later on, please go ahead and give us a rating. Throw us some stars on Apple Podcast or Spotify or all the places that you can rate the content you listen to, and we will thank you for it. If you write a review, we'll even read it out here out loud. Unless, of course, it says, you guys suck.
Yeah, at which point I might still read it out loud because I think it's hilarious.
We'd love to have you engage with us. Certainly, you can put your replies down in this video, and we respond to those. We value hearing from our listeners and engaging, but the better way to engage with us is to join us on Discord. There's an invite to our Discord server here with the video and with the audio feed. Come be part of our group. Hang out. We have lots of people there in the server interacting about the Wheel of Time, Dune, The Expanse, now the Chronicles of Narnia, maybe. Who knows? But whatever in fantasy and sci-fi literature that you like to talk about, you'll find someone on our server who's willing to talk to you about it as well. And as Discord is saying right now in this live recording, we have cookies. Wait, we do? We have cookies?
Yes,
Okay,
make
we
sure
may
they're
not
turned on.
actually have cookies. Oh, the cookies on our computer. Nice, nice. What are other ways that they can engage with us, Zach?
Well, our other social media platforms, Twitter, where we're most active, Instagram, where you'll find our drink recipes and some other tidbits, and Facebook, where we exist occasionally because it still technically is an existing platform.
That's
You
right.
also can
It
go
is.
old fashioned, send us an email. Do not send us normal mail. We do not receive it. I do not know who you are sending it to, but it's quite entertaining that someone else is getting our mail. Uh, but we do have that email, fantasyfortheages@gmail.com.
Right. There are two additional ways you can connect with us, and by doing so, you'd be supporting us and helping
Mm-hmm.
us pay for all the stuff. I mean, putting it on YouTube in this kind of quality actually costs money. Right now, it really costs me money. I let my son freeload. He just covers his own tech now. I'm the one paying for all the hosting stuff, and anyway, but that's okay because I make more money than him, so that's how it works.
For now, I'm working on it.
Yeah, one day he's going to pay for my retirement home, and I am counting on that.
Uh,
So we invite you to check out our merch shop. We don't have much there yet, but we've got a couple of different kinds of mugs and cups that you can get, and they're fun and they work, and I own them and I like them. And join us on Patreon. Be like people here today who have been with us in the live recording, interacting and posting their humor on Discord with us, and that makes our shows better. We enjoy
oh,
having
yeah.
people with us. It's fun. And the more of you who show up in the live recordings, the more you can interact with each other and even if necessary, make fun of us. And we're good with that too, especially if it's
Yeah.
about Zach. Let's see, Zach, because I'll make fun of him. That'd be fine. All
Yeah,
in
I
good
can take it.
love.
I
Yeah,
can take it.
yeah. And you can give it. We know that too. All right. That's what we've got. Anything else? Any last thing you want to say, Zach?
Nope. I'm good.
Awesome. All right, then. We'll talk to you next time.